We're going to be looking at disappointment and how God uses it in our lives. By this time you may have heard the sermon, but God will take the disappointments in our lives and draw us to Himself, remind us that people are not God, but He is God, and that He is working His purposes all along. Now, those purposes are really well illustrated in the life of Joseph, and so I want to draw your mind to the book of Genesis. I got it open in front of me here, and it's chapter 37 where his life is laid out. You're going to see the account of Joseph, his father being named Jacob, and Israel, those names used interchangeably, and let your people know that. But I encourage you in your group to read chapter 37 and to assign different sections. Ask 3 or 4 people to read. You'll see the discussion questions, and they're broken down into some verse sections. And so ask somebody, will you read this part out loud? Will you read this part out loud? And will you read this part out loud? And you may keep your eyes open for people who feel real self-conscious about reading in groups. Some people just don't read out loud well, so be sensitive to that. But anyway, Joseph, his story, his brothers, as you recall, they hate him. They're jealous, they're envious, and they sell him into slavery, okay? Now, when we look at those guys and how they deal with their disappointment, they take it out in anger and rage and envy and lying and all these principles of unhealthy relationships. So you can draw those out along the way. You might read through chapter 37 and then all the way to 50. Now, a lot of you don't have time to read all of that before you meet, but if you do, it's awesome. Let me summarize just in case you aren't going to be able to do that. Joseph is sold into slavery. He goes through incredibly difficult times, but eventually emerges as the right-hand man to Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. A famine hits up north in the land of Israel, and so Joseph's brothers all come down looking for food. They don't know that he has this power. And through a series of events, eventually Joseph's father comes down and he's with them as well in Egypt. Now, when the guys first realize that their younger brother is basically functioning like the king, they're scared to death. But he reassures them that God has put him in that position to save lives. It's a wonderful imagery and picture and depiction of how God rescues us through other people's stories, other people's difficulties. It can lead them to a place of being used of Him and rescuing many lives. So let's fast forward to chapter 50. The father, Jacob, he dies. He actually blesses his sons, but his sons are scared because they think now that Joseph's going to retaliate for all the evil that they did to him. And so they come and they talk to him and they say that our dad told you to forgive our sins. And Joseph, he wept. He was so sad, and he said these words. He said, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." As you're preparing for this, think about disappointments you've experienced, very specifically disappointments you've experienced with other believers. Maybe a leader that was there for you and frankly, perhaps they hurt you. Maybe it was someone who didn't hurt you, but they were just absent, they were gone. Maybe a tragedy happened in their life or they needed to move somewhere else. And think for a moment about the heartache that took place. And though the enemy, if not the actual person himself, may have intended harm, God intended good. These are the realities that God draws us into when He allows these disappointments to take place. He doesn't put them in our lives so much as we just experience them because we're fallen humans. So draw people out and help them speak openly and honestly about their disappointments. Now, some people may be hesitant to name a person that they've been disappointed with. Either one, because they can't think of anybody, or two, they're just not being vulnerable. Draw them out and let them know they don't need to name anybody. That may not be appropriate. That may be gossip, or that may be dishonoring. But do draw people out to speak honestly, because what we want to do is allow God and His Word to speak to our hearts, and for us to be able to speak to one another His Word and to pray for each other. Again, everybody, thanks so much for taking seriously the call to help people grow spiritually. And I'll be praying for you and would love to hear from you. Please let me know how your groups are going. I'm hearing some wonderful things, even right out of our first few weeks here. So please keep me up to speed. I look forward to seeing you all soon.